Welcome back to Gravepath Stories. Tonight, I have 10 true scary basement apartment horror stories for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the grave path, you don't walk alone. I was crouched behind the furnace with my shoulder jammed against the concrete wall when my knuckles scraped metal that shouldn't have been there. And I remember freezing in that exact position because the sound was wrong, too flat and solid to be a pipe. I leaned closer, brushed away a curtain of dust and insulation fibers, and my fingers traced the edge of a steel door set directly into the foundation. It was painted the same dull gray as the wall, but the seams were clean, intentional. My first thought was that the landlord had forgotten to mention a utility access. My second thought, the one that made my stomach tighten, was that I had already memorized every inch of this basement apartment out of boredom and necessity, and that door had never been there before. I stood up too fast and smacked my head on the furnace duct, swore under my breath, then crouched back down and looked again. It hadn't appeared overnight. I knew that. I'd been down here every evening since moving in, checking the pilot light, listening to the pipes knock, trying to convince myself that living below ground didn't bother me. That door had been hidden behind stacked insulation boards when I moved in. Someone had shifted them. I pressed my palm flat against the metal. It was cold, colder than the surrounding concrete, like it was connected to something deeper. There was no handle, just a circular plate about the size of my fist, with a narrow slot in the center. I wiped my hand on my coveralls and felt my pulse thudding in my throat. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings were full of sealed access points. Still, I grabbed my flashlight from the tool bag and angled it along the door's edge. The paint was chipped where something had rubbed against it repeatedly. I didn't open it then. I finished relighting the furnace, packed up my tools, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, trying to talk myself out of the unease crawling up my spine. I'd been a maintenance worker for the city long enough to know when something didn't line up. Curiosity is part of the job, but so is knowing when to call it in. I decided I'd check the municipal blueprints the next day, just to put my mind at ease. The next morning at the office, I pulled the microfilm for the block where my apartment sat, an older municipal services building converted into rentals. The clerk gave me a look but didn't ask questions. When I found the basement level plans, my mouth went dry. There it was, plain as day, labeled as an active utility corridor branching off the furnace room. Not decommissioned, not sealed, active. I stared at that word longer than I care to admit. Active meant inspected. Active meant used. Active meant someone had been lying, either to me or to the city. I checked the revision dates. The most recent update was only a few months old. I folded the printout and drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to ache. I kept thinking about the insulation boards being moved, about the scuffed paint. When I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not rot, not sewage, something cleaner, almost chemical, like disinfectant. The insulation boards were stacked neatly to the side now. The metal door was fully exposed. Someone had been in my apartment. I didn't call out. I set my tool bag down quietly and listened. The furnace hummed. Pipes clicked. Nothing else. I locked the apartment door behind me, then stood there feeling stupid for locking myself in with whatever had been here. I told myself maybe the landlord had come by. Maybe he'd meant to tell me. But the thought rang hollow. I went back to the door and examined it more closely. The circular plate had faint scratches around it now, fresh ones. I tried twisting it. It didn't budge. I tried sliding a screwdriver into the slot. There was resistance, then a soft click that echoed deeper than it should have. The plate rotated, and the door released with a sigh of pressure, like a breath being let out. I hesitated, then pulled. The door opened inward, revealing a narrow concrete corridor sloping down at a shallow angle. There were lights spaced evenly along the ceiling, fluorescent tubes humming softly. They were on. I stood there, heart hammering, and did what I always did when something crossed the line from odd to serious. I documented it. I took out my notepad and wrote the time in words. Wrote down what I was seeing, forced myself into professional mode. Then I stepped through. The door closed behind me on its own, not slamming, just settling shut with a finality that made my skin prickle. I resisted the urge to spin around and yank it open again. I walked forward instead, counting my steps, noting the condition of the walls. This wasn't an abandoned space. The floor was clean. There were scuff marks consistent with carts or gurneys. The air smelled filtered. About 30 paces in, the corridor leveled out and split. One branch continued straight. The other turned right. Both were marked with stenciled lettering that had been painted over and repainted, layers of history bleeding through. I could make out fragments of old department names. Water, health, records. I followed the right branch because I heard something there. A rhythmic sound, like a machine cycling. As I moved closer, it resolved into a low mechanical thrum, steady and deliberate. My mouth went dry. I told myself it could be anything. Pumps, ventilation. The corridor opened into a room the size of a small gym, filled with metal cabinets and tables. On one table lay a stack of files, yellowed folders stamped with dates. Recent dates. I picked one up with shaking hands and flipped it open. Inside were inspection reports, not for infrastructure, for people. Names, ages, notes about compliance, about relocation readiness. My name was on one of the tabs. I dropped the folder like it had burned me. That was when the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, intentional. I turned slowly and saw a man standing in the doorway I'd come through. He wore coveralls like mine, but newer, cleaner. He didn't look surprised to see me. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," he said calmly. I demanded an explanation, my voice cracking despite my effort to keep it steady. He sighed, rubbed his face, and told me to come with him. He said, if I didn't, things would get complicated. I asked complicated how. He didn't answer. He led me back the way I'd come, past the split, further down the straight corridor this time. We passed doors set into the walls, some with observation windows, others sealed tight. I heard movement behind a few of them. I didn't ask questions. I was afraid of the answers. We stopped at a control room filled with monitors. On the screens were live feeds of basement apartments across the city. Not just municipal buildings, private rentals, older homes, places people went when they couldn't afford better. He told me the program had started decades ago as a civil defense measure, underground corridors connecting key buildings. Over time, it evolved. They used the spaces to monitor populations that were considered transient, vulnerable, unlikely to be missed. Maintenance workers, single tenants, people without strong community ties. I asked him why my name was on a folder. He looked at me for a long moment, then said I'd been flagged because I noticed patterns. Because I asked questions. Because I worked in places most people ignored. I told him I was leaving and going public. He nodded like he'd expected that. He pressed a button on the console, and one of the screens zoomed in on my apartment. On my bed, where my notepad lay open, my morning notes visible. He said they could make it look like an accident, or they could offer me a choice. Keep quiet, keep working, and get reassigned to oversight. Help them maintain the system. I don't know how long I stood there weighing that. It felt like hours. I thought about my life, about how little would change if I disappeared. That hurt more than the threat. I told him no. He looked genuinely disappointed. He escorted me back to my apartment, unlocked the door from the inside, and told me I had one day to move out. He said if I tried anything, the city would bury it. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed my things and left before morning. I filed a report anyway, anonymously, with copies of what I'd seen. It went nowhere. The blueprints were updated. The corridor was relabeled as decommissioned. I still work maintenance, but not for the city. Sometimes, when I'm in a basement, I feel along the walls for seams that don't belong. I know now that some doors are hidden for a reason, and some systems are only active as long as no one forces them into the light. I was already halfway down the narrow concrete stairs when the lights went out again, and I remember saying out loud, "You've got to be kidding me," because that made the darkness feel less heavy. My tool bag bumped against my leg, metal clinking softly. And I froze for a second, counting my breaths, listening to the hum that never quite stopped. The power was dead in the apartment, but something was still running. I could feel it through the soles of my boots. A low vibration that didn't belong to any legal system I'd ever installed. I fumbled my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. The beam caught the breaker panel at the bottom of the stairs, the door already open from my earlier check. I'd flipped every switch to off less than 10 minutes earlier, watched the lights die upstairs, and told the tenant I needed to trace the line. He'd nodded too quickly and retreated to the far end of the basement unit like he wanted distance from me, not the darkness. The panel was still dead. No indicators, no warmth, no sound. But the vibration was stronger down here, and it made my teeth feel slightly numb. I pressed my palm to the concrete wall and felt it clearly then, a steady pulse, like a machine breathing somewhere below my feet. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to fit that sensation into something familiar. Backup generators were common enough, but they were loud, obvious, and required permits. This building didn't have one on record. I knew that because I'd checked before accepting the job. Residential quarter. Old structure, single basement unit added decades later. Straightforward, the property manager had said. Just power flickers at night. I followed the conduit line along the ceiling, my light tracing its path as it disappeared behind a false wall near the storage area. That was new. I hadn't noticed it before, or maybe it hadn't been obvious in the earlier light. I tapped it with my knuckles. Hollow. Definitely not part of the original structure. When I pushed, it shifted slightly, enough to make dust fall into my hair. Behind it was another conduit. Thicker, newer, running straight down into the floor, instead of up toward the main service. I swore again, quieter this time, because that didn't make sense. Power was supposed to come in from above, not below. I thought about calling the property manager, but my phone had no signal down here, and the vibration was getting harder to ignore. It wasn't just sound anymore. It felt intentional, like whatever was running didn't want to be shut off. I grabbed my voltage tester and pressed it against the conduit. It lit up instantly. That's not possible. I whispered, because I had personally killed every feed to this unit. I followed the line to where it vanished into a square metal hatch set into the floor, almost flush with the concrete. The edges were sealed with thick industrial caulking, still slightly rubbery. When I pressed my finger to it, I stared at that hatch longer than I care to admit. In my head, I was already listing reasons not to open it. Unauthorized modifications, safety violations, things that would become my problem the second I touched them. But I also thought about the tenant upstairs, the way he'd said the lights flickered mostly at night, how he'd asked if I could just make it stop. I cut through the seal with my utility knife. The smell hit me first, warm air mixed with oil and something metallic. When I pulled the hatch open, the vibration intensified, rattling the loose screws in my tool bag. A ladder descended into darkness. I told myself I'd just look. That was it. 5 minutes, confirm what I already suspected, then get out and report it. I started down, my boots clenching softly on the rungs, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the low mechanical thrum below. The room I stepped into wasn't large, but it was crowded. A generator sat against one wall, far bigger than anything meant for a single apartment. Its casing scratched and dented, fuel lines running into barrels stacked neatly beside it. Thick cables snaked away from it, disappearing through a hole bored into the far concrete wall. The generator was running clean, too clean. Whoever installed it knew what they were doing. Fresh filters, recent maintenance. I felt a flash of professional admiration before the rest of the scene caught up with me. The cables didn't go up. They went sideways. I followed them into a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for my shoulders, the air growing warmer with each step. My light flickered, not from lack of power, but interference. The hum was louder here, joined by a faint clicking sound, rhythmic and precise. The corridor opened into another room, larger, unfinished. This one held racks of equipment I didn't immediately recognize. Servers, maybe, or something similar, stacked from floor to ceiling. Each one had a small indicator light, all glowing steady green. The clicking came from them, thousands of tiny sounds layered together. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't a private setup for convenience. This was infrastructure. "What the hell is this?" I said, my voice sounding too loud in the enclosed space. That's when I heard footsteps above me, muffled but unmistakable. Someone moving in the basement apartment. I realized with a cold jolt that the tenant was directly overhead, separated from me by a few feet of concrete and a lie of an apartment. I backed away slowly, my light sweeping across the racks. Labels were affixed to some of them, handwritten, date spanning years. None recent, all older than I expected. Going back before the building's last renovation. I reached out and touched one of the cables. It was warm, alive with current. Whatever these machines were powering, it wasn't just the apartment. The apartment was a cover. My phone buzzed suddenly in my pocket, making me flinch hard enough to stumble. A text from the property manager, somehow finally delivered. Any update? Tenant says lights are back but noise is worse. I typed back with shaking thumbs. There is unauthorized equipment under the unit. Large generator. I am leaving now. I didn't wait for a reply. I retraced my steps quickly, too quickly. My boot slipping once on the ladder rung as I climbed back toward the hatch. The hum followed me, unchanged, indifferent. When I pulled myself back into the basement apartment, the lights flickered on overhead, steady and bright. The tenant stood at the far end of the room, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "You fixed it," he said. "No," I replied. "I didn't. And you need to leave. This place isn't safe." He smiled then, small and tired. "It has to stay on." I didn't argue. I grabbed my bag and headed for the stairs, my skin crawling as I felt the vibration through the steps. At the top, I turned back once, against my better judgment. "What's down there?" I asked. He hesitated just a second too long. "Not my job," he said. I reported everything. City inspectors, utility company, even the police. They sealed the building within days. The generator was removed. The equipment confiscated. I was told, officially, that it was an illegal data operation. Nothing dangerous, nothing worth worrying about. But a week later, I got a call from a colleague who'd been brought in after me. He sounded shaken. "They found another room," he said. "Below the server room, no equipment, just space and markings on the walls, like someone planned to put something there." I still feel that hum sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. A memory in my bones. Whatever that generator powered, it wasn't just machines. It was intention. And shutting it off felt less like fixing a problem and more like interrupting something that had been patiently waiting to be finished. I was pulling damp clothes from the washer when the machines above me kicked on again, and I remember saying out loud, "That can't be right," because I knew the laundry room upstairs was locked after evening hours, and my daughter was already asleep on the mattress behind me. The vibration traveled through the ceiling, down the walls, and into the floor. A steady mechanical shudder that felt too heavy to be just washing. I stood there holding a dripping shirt, listening as the sound shifted, not spinning, not draining, but thumping in short, deliberate bursts, as if someone were moving weight from one foot to the other. I shut off my own machine and waited. Breath caught, counting the seconds between impacts. That was when I heard the answering sound behind my bedroom wall, a dull knock. Close enough that I pressed my palm against the plaster and felt it tremble in time with the machine above. My first thought was pipes. My second was that pipes did not knock back. I checked my watch and whispered, "It's past midnight," feeling foolish and tense all at once. The machines continued, and the wall responded, as if two rooms were speaking through me. I stepped into the hallway, heart racing, already knowing I would not sleep until I understood what was happening tonight. I crept into the bedroom and sat on the edge of my daughter's bed. listening to her breathing while the ceiling hummed above us. The vibration had a pattern now, 3 heavy pulses, a pause, then 2 quicker ones, repeating with a patience that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was coincidence, old building, shared walls. But when I leaned my ear against the plaster, the sound sharpened into something more deliberate, like hands dragging across concrete. I knocked once, lightly, feeling ridiculous. The response came instantly, a firm knock from the other side, exactly where my head rested. I pulled back, throat tight, and whispered my daughter's name to be sure she was still asleep. She was. I went to the door and locked it, then checked the small window near the ceiling, which looked out onto nothing but a strip of grass and the laundry room's foundation. The machines above stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so complete my ears rang. I stood there waiting, counting my breaths, when the wall knocked again, once slowly, as if asking a question. I did not answer. I sat on the floor until morning, back against the bed, telling myself fear could invent rhythms and meaning where none existed. By daylight, everything looked harmless again. I walked upstairs with my daughter to check the laundry room, expecting to see a note about broken machines or late-night use. The room was empty, the washers silent, their lids open and dry. I asked the woman from the second floor if she had done laundry late. She frowned and said the room was locked after evening, always had been. When I mentioned the noise, she shrugged and said basements echoed, that old buildings carried sound strangely. I nodded embarrassed, but when I returned downstairs, I noticed something I had missed before. The wall behind my bed had a faint vertical line, a hairline crack running from floor to ceiling, hidden by the wardrobe. I pressed it gently and felt a hollow give, not solid brick as I had assumed, but something thinner. That night, the machine started again at the same late hour, and so did the answering knocks. I lay awake, eyes open, counting the pattern until it burned into my thoughts. 3, pause, 2. 3, pause, 2. When I moved the wardrobe away from the wall, the crack widened enough to reveal a narrow seam, darker than the surrounding plaster, as if it had been opened and closed many times before. I did not tell anyone at first. I was a single mother with limited money and fewer options, and fear felt like a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I tried to map the sounds. When the machines ran, the wall answered. When they stopped, the wall sometimes continued, slower, exploratory taps that made me picture fingers searching. One night, I placed my ear against the seam and whispered, "Who is there?" My voice sounded small and foolish, but I needed to know. The answer was not a voice, but a shift, a sliding sound, followed by a soft exhale, close enough that I felt warm air through the plaster. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and gathered my daughter into my arms without waking her. I slept sitting up again, counting until morning. The next day, I went to the landlord's office and described the noises. He smiled thinly and said the building had old service corridors, sealed decades ago. Nothing to worry about. When I asked about the wall, his smile faded. He said repairs would be expensive, unnecessary. That night, the knocking changed. The pattern broke, replaced by irregular scraping that traveled upward, as if something were climbing inside the wall itself. I started keeping notes, writing down times and patterns like evidence might protect me. The machines always began just after midnight. The scraping followed. Sometimes I heard water running, not above, but beside me, a wet sloshing that made me think of hidden drains. I tried sleeping in the living area, but the sounds followed, muffled but persistent, like someone learning the layout of my fear. One evening, while my daughter played, I pressed harder against the seam and felt it shift. A thin panel moved inward, just enough to reveal darkness beyond. The smell that escaped was stale and damp, carrying something metallic underneath. I slammed it shut and pushed the wardrobe back, hands shaking. That night, the knocking came harder, angrier, rattling the bed frame. I shouted for it to stop, my voice cracking, and for the first time, a voice answered, low and strained, speaking Dutch so softly I could barely make out the words. "Laundry," it said, and then, "Police." I did not respond. I called the police the next morning, reporting a person in the walls. They searched the laundry room, found nothing, and suggested stress. When they left, the wall knocked once, sharp and accusing. I knew then that ignoring it had only made it bolder. I waited until my daughter was at school and opened the panel again, this time with a flashlight. The space beyond was narrow, a service corridor barely wide enough to turn around in, lined with pipes and cables. Fresh footprints marked the dust. I followed them a short distance until I reached a small chamber directly beneath the laundry room. A man stood there, thin and pale, surrounded by buckets and hoses rigged into the building's plumbing. He raised his hands when he saw me, eyes wild, and began explaining, talking over himself about needing water, about hiding, about how the machines masked the noise. He had been living there for years, moving through the corridors, tapping walls to learn where people slept. He said he knocked because he was lonely. I backed away and ran, calling the police again, my voice steadier this time. They arrested him that afternoon. The landlord avoided my eyes. The wall was sealed properly within days. After it was over, I moved. I did not wait for the lease to end. My daughter never knew the details, only that we left because it was safer elsewhere. Sometimes, when I hear a washing machine start late at night, my body still tenses, expecting an answer from behind a wall. But nothing ever comes. I tell you this now because it sounds unbelievable, and because I need someone to understand that fear can be logical, earned, built from patterns and proof. The knocking stopped because the man was real, the corridors were real, and the danger was never imagined. I learned to trust the quiet when it finally returned, and to listen carefully when it does not. I was halfway down the emergency stairs when I realized they were sloping the wrong way, my boot heel slipping on concrete dust as I grabbed the railing and laughed under my breath, telling myself I was tired, misreading things, because emergency exits always go up. I had been volunteering all evening, inventorying old shelters for civil defense records, and my hands still smelled like paper and rust. I remember calling out to the landlord, asking if this was really the exit, and hearing my own voice echo strangely, stretched thin, as if the stairwell was longer than it should have been. I kept going because stopping felt more foolish than continuing. The sign above the door clearly showed a running figure and an arrow, and I trusted signs. I always had. That was the point of the work I did, trusting systems, trusting planning. Each step took me deeper, and the air grew cooler, heavier, carrying a smell I recognized too well from training drills, stale metal, old water, and something faintly electrical. My heart rate picked up, not from fear yet, but from the mental checklist forming in my head. Shelters. Cold War construction. Jiva Skyled had plenty of them. When I reached the bottom, there was no outside door. Just a wide corridor with yellowed paint and another sign, this one hand stenciled, pointing farther down. I remember thinking about fire codes, about how many violations this place must have, and how I would mention it casually to the landlord later, maybe suggest a fix. I wasn't scared yet. I was curious, professional curiosity, the kind that gets you into trouble. I walked forward and my footsteps sounded wrong, not sharp enough, like the floor was padded. The lights flickered on automatically as I moved, old fluorescent tubes buzzing awake one by one. That's when I noticed the dust wasn't settled evenly. There were tracks, recent ones, not just footprints but drag marks, as if heavy carts had been moved through recently. I stopped and listened, holding my breath, and somewhere far ahead there was a low hum, steady and alive. I told myself it was a generator. Of course it was a generator. Shelters had them. But something about the sound bothered me. It wasn't fluctuating. It didn't cough or rattle. It was smooth, intentional. I reached for my flashlight, even though the lights were on, and felt my hands shaking slightly. I remember being annoyed at myself for that. The corridor opened into a larger room with rows of benches bolted to the floor and faded posters about rationing and air filtration. This was unmistakably a shelter, but not one listed in my records. I knew them all, or thought I did. I stepped inside, reading the signs automatically, and that's when I saw the coffee cups. Fresh ones, steam still clinging to the lids. I stood there, staring, my mind scrambling to explain it. Someone else from the city. Another volunteer. No one had told me about this. I called out, my voice louder now, and it came back to me flattened, swallowed by the space. Then a door opened at the far end, and a woman stepped out, older than me, wearing a grey sweater and an armband with a symbol I recognized, but hadn't seen outside archives. Civil defense, yes, but obsolete. She looked surprised to see me, genuinely so, and asked what unit I was with. I told her my name, my assignment, and watched confusion spread across her face. She asked what year it was. I laughed again awkwardly, thinking it was a joke, and said 1987. She went pale. She told me they were scheduled to remain sealed until further notice. She said drills had been suspended months ago, that communication lines had gone dead, and that they were waiting for instructions. I asked who they were, and she gestured behind her. People, families, children, living down here. My fear arrived quietly then, like a switch flipping. I told her there must be a mistake, that no one had authorized continued occupation, and she looked at me like I was the one who didn't understand. She said the exit upstairs was compromised, that outside conditions were unsafe. I argued, listing facts, dates, protocols, but my words sounded thin in my own ears. She invited me to sit to explain, but every instinct told me not to stay. I backed away, saying I needed to report this, and her expression hardened. She said reporting was what caused the last panic. She said people died because someone went upstairs when they weren't supposed to. I turned and ran. I didn't care about professionalism then. I ran back down the corridor, boots pounding, heart in my throat, and the lights flicked off behind me one by one. The hum grew louder, almost soothing, like a breath. When I reached the stairs, I took them two at a time, lungs burning, and burst back into my apartment hallway. Everything was normal. Too normal. I locked the door, leaned against it, and slid to the floor, laughing and crying at the same time. The next day, I reported a minor structural issue and moved out a week later. The building was demolished years after that. Officially, no shelter was ever found beneath it. I still hear that hum sometimes when I'm tired, and I remind myself I got out. I followed the stairs that went the wrong way, and I came back up. I was crouched by the basement window, wiping condensation from the glass with my sleeve, when the envelope slid through the slot and landed on the floor between my boots. I remember freezing with my hands still raised. My breath caught halfway out because I had been staring straight at the slot when it happened. There was no knock, no footsteps, no shadow passing over the window. Just the dry scrape of paper, and then the soft sound of it hitting concrete. I picked it up slowly, already feeling stupid for how fast my heart was beating. It was addressed in neat, careful handwriting to a man named Harold P. Collins. Not me. The return address was local, stamped with a postal mark dated 2 days earlier. I checked my watch out of habit, even though I knew the date. 1999. Same year it had been every day since I moved in. This was the third envelope that month. I carried it over to the small table, where I ate my meals, and turned it over in my hands, looking for anything that explained how it had gotten there. The slot was built into the window frame, old and narrow, just wide enough for mail. The landlord had told me it was from when the unit was rented separately decades ago. Nobody used it anymore, except apparently someone still did. I stacked the envelope with the other two I had kept instead of throwing out. All three were addressed to the same name, same handwriting, different return addresses around St. John. Power company, medical clinic, a handwritten one with no logo at all recent. All postmarked years after the man was supposed to be dead. I only knew that because I had asked. The first envelope had shown up my second week there. I had done the responsible thing and brought it upstairs to Mrs. Donnelly, who owned the house. She stared at the name for a long moment, then shook her head. "He died in this apartment," she said. Just like that. No hesitation, no drama, like she was telling me the bus schedule. She told me it had been years ago. Heart attack, she thought. Found alone, no family nearby. She said the mail must be some kind of mistake and told me to throw it away. When I asked how it could be postmarked so recently, she frowned and said the postal service messed up all the time. I believed her. Or I wanted to. But standing there with the third envelope in my hand, knowing it had slid through that slot while I was watching, I felt something tighten behind my ribs. I opened it without thinking, ripping the paper cleanly down the side. Inside was a single folded sheet. No letterhead, just handwriting. It said, "They are going through my things again. Please tell them to stop." I sat down hard in the chair. The room felt smaller immediately, like the ceiling had lowered an inch. I read it again, slower this time, tracing the ink with my eyes. The handwriting matched the address. Careful, controlled, old-fashioned. I told myself it was a prank, some neighbor messing with me. But who would know the name? Who would know about the slot? That night I barely slept. Every small sound felt too loud. Pipes clicking, the refrigerator cycling on. I kept imagining the scrape of paper against wood. At one point, sometime after 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something brushing against the outside of the window, and I lay there staring at the ceiling until my eyes burned. The next morning, I took the letters to the Public Records Office during my lunch break. I told the clerk I was researching a former tenant. She pulled up a file and confirmed it easily. Harold Collins. Died 8 years earlier. Address matched my apartment. No forwarding address. No active accounts. Any chance someone else with the same name lives nearby? I asked. She shook her head. Not in this district. I left with copies of the death record folded in my pocket, feeling both relieved and worse. Relieved that I hadn't imagined the name. Worse because that meant something else was happening. When I got home that evening, there was another envelope waiting on the floor. This one was thicker, padded, addressed the same way. I didn't open it right away. I stood there staring at it, listening to the quiet hum of the house above me, to Mrs. Donnelly moving around in her kitchen. Everything normal. Everything wrong. Inside the envelope was a small brass key taped to a piece of paper. The note read, "They took this from me. It opens the trunk." I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, the key cold in my palm. I didn't know what trunk meant, but something in me knew I was going to find out. I went upstairs and knocked on Mrs. Donnelly's door. She looked annoyed until she saw my face. "I need to know exactly what happened down there," I said. "Everything." She hesitated, then stepped aside and let me in. Her living room smelled like lemon cleaner and old upholstery. She sat heavily in a chair and folded her hands. "He didn't have much," she said. "A few boxes. An old trunk. We cleared it out after he died. Had to. The city inspected." "Where did you put it?" I asked. She looked at me sharply. "Why?" "Because I think someone is still using my mailbox," I said. "And they're sending me keys." Her face drained of color. She stared at the hallway that led to the basement stairs, then back at me. "The trunk's still down there," she said quietly. "In the storage room. I couldn't get it open." We went down together. The storage room was at the end of a narrow corridor, a space I had avoided because it smelled damp and unused. The trunk sat against the far wall, dusty, untouched. The lock matched the key. My hands shook as I turned it. The lid creaked open. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, dozens of them, all addressed to Harold Collins. Recent dates. On top lay a bundle of photographs. They showed my apartment, taken from angles that made my skin crawl. Me at the table, me asleep on the couch, me standing by the window. At the bottom was a final letter. It said, "If you are reading this, then they have finally let you see me." I didn't read the rest there. I slammed the trunk shut and stumbled back into my apartment, my head buzzing. I locked the door and sat on the bed, the letter shaking in my hands. It went on for pages. Harold wrote about waking up after his heart stopped, about being unable to leave, about watching strangers move into his space, touch his things, live his life, about learning how to push paper through the slot, how to write without hands. "They don't hear me," he wrote, "but you did." The last line made my throat close. "Please finish it." I knew what that meant. The trunk, the body, something unfinished. I called the police. I showed them everything, the letters, the trunk, the photos. They listened, skeptical but thorough. They brought in investigators. They searched the walls, the floors. Behind a false panel in the storage room, they found bones. Mrs. Donnelly was arrested that night. She had panicked years earlier, tried to hide the death, to avoid inspections, to keep renting the space. She had never cleared the apartment properly, never reported the body. She had sealed it away and lived above it all these years. After they took her away, the mail stopped. No more envelopes, no more notes. I moved out a month later. On my last day, as I was carrying the final box up the stairs, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like pressure releasing. I don't know what happened to Harold after the truth came out. I hope he's gone. Sometimes, though, when I hear paper sliding through a slot somewhere, my chest tightens, and I think about how patiently he waited to be heard. I was halfway down the narrow basement steps, with a tray of pills in my hand, when I heard the wheelchair roll across the floor above me. Slow and deliberate, the rubber wheels making that soft hollow sound they only make on old wood. I froze there, one hand gripping the rail. My heart immediately kicking up, because Mrs. Tanaka had not been out of bed in 3 weeks, and I had tucked her in myself less than an hour earlier. At first I told myself it was the television. The upstairs unit was small, sounds traveled, and old houses always made noises. Still, I stayed on the steps, listening. The sound continued, a gentle roll, then a pause, then a faint creak like someone shifting their weight. I called her name, softly at first, then louder, my voice bouncing up the stairwell. There was no answer. I went back up, my shoes suddenly feeling too loud, my breath shallow. Her bedroom door was open. She was exactly where I had left her, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, hands folded on the blanket. The wheelchair was parked beside the bed, its brakes locked. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it, feeling foolish and unsettled at the same time. She woke when I adjusted her blanket. "You're late," she said, voice thin but clear. "I'm sorry," I told her. "Did you get up just now?" She frowned, genuinely confused. "I can't," she said. "You know that." I did know. That was the problem. The first week I moved into the basement unit, everything felt manageable. The space was cramped. Low ceiling, one small window near the ground, but it was clean and close enough that night checks were easy. I needed the money. Live, in care paid better, especially during that year when everyone was afraid to bring outsiders into their homes. Mrs. Tanaka's son lived 2 prefectures away. He called every Sunday, thanked me politely, and asked if his mother was eating well. The sound started on the 4th night. Not loud, not dramatic. Just movement. Wheels rolling, a soft thud, like something bumping into furniture, then stillness. Each time I went upstairs, everything was unchanged. Each time Mrs. Tanaka insisted she had not moved. "You hear too much," she told me once, almost kindly. "This house remembers things." I laughed then, uncomfortable but not scared. Old people said strange things. It was part of the job. By the end of the 2nd week, the timing became consistent. Always after midnight. Always while I was awake, never in my sleep. That bothered me more than the sounds themselves. If I had been dreaming, I could have dismissed it. But I was always alert, usually charting notes or folding laundry when the wheels began to roll. One night I stayed on the basement floor, lights off, ear pressed to the ceiling. The sound moved from the bedroom to the hall, then stopped right above me. I felt it in my chest, a vibration, like someone standing still. I whispered, "Mrs. Tanaka." Her voice came immediately, weak and irritated. "Why are you shouting? I'm trying to sleep." I didn't go upstairs that time. I sat there until morning, my back against the wall, telling myself I was overworked, that stress did strange things to the brain. The next day I found a new dent in the hallway wall upstairs, right at wheelchair height. The paint was cracked. When I touched it, a small chip fell to the floor. I showed it to her. "Did you bump the wall?" She looked at it, then away. "That's not new," she said. "It was new. I cleaned that hallway every day." That night, when the wheelchair started moving, I followed it. I didn't turn on any lights. I moved slowly up the stairs, each step deliberate, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The sound led me down the hall, past her bedroom, toward the spare room that had been locked since I arrived. The wheelchair stopped in front of that door. I stood there, holding my breath. The handle didn't move. Nothing dramatic happened. After a long minute, the sound reversed, rolling back toward the bedroom, then stopping. I waited another minute before opening the spare room myself. It was empty. Dusty, unused, exactly as it had been. I told myself I would mention it to her son. I rehearsed the call in my head. I never made it. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of knocking, not upstairs, on the basement door. Slow, rhythmic, like someone tapping with patience. I sat up in bed, every muscle tight. "Hello," I called. The knocking continued. I opened the door. The stairwell was empty. Above me, I heard the wheelchair again, closer this time, directly at the top of the stairs. I backed into my unit, locked the door, and stood there shaking. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, Mrs. Tanaka asked me why I had been moving furniture at night. "I wasn't," I said. She smiled, small and tired. "It's all right," she said. "It needs to stretch its legs sometimes." I asked her what she meant. She stared at me for a long time before answering. "My husband used that chair before me," she said. "He hated being trapped. He hated waiting." I didn't ask more. I should have. Instead, I tried to rationalize it. Grief hallucinations, memory, house sounds, anything but what it felt like. The final night came quietly. No sounds, no movement. I almost convinced myself it was over. Then I heard the wheelchair roll down the stairs. The sound was unmistakable. Closer than ever. Coming for me. I stood frozen in the center of the room as it reached my door. I saw the handle turn. I heard the door open. The chair rolled in, empty, stopping inches from me. Behind it, on the floor, were wet tracks from hands that did not belong to anyone alive. Upstairs, Mrs. Tanaka slept peacefully for the last time. When her son arrived the next day, he told me the spare room had once been his father's. He had died there, in the chair, alone. I moved out that afternoon. I never worked live in care again. I still hear wheels at night, sometimes when I can't sleep. They never stop outside my door anymore. I was dragging my last suitcase across the concrete floor when my elbow caught the boiler pipe and sent a sharp clang through the room, loud enough to make me flinch and freeze. My heart was already racing from the move, from the feeling of being underground. from the relief of finally having a place where I thought no one would bother me. I stood there holding my breath, listening, half expecting someone upstairs to shout or bang on the ceiling, but nothing happened. Just the hum of the boiler and my own breathing, uneven and too fast. I remember thinking, just calm down, you're alone now. That was the whole point of this place. A basement apartment, cheap, quiet. No curious neighbors watching me come and go, no landlord dropping by unannounced. After everything I had gone through that year, I needed anonymity more than comfort. I needed somewhere I could exist without explaining myself. I finished pushing the suitcase against the wall and wiped my hands on my jeans. The apartment was basically one long room with a kitchenette at one end, and the boiler sectioned off behind a thin plywood wall. The landlord had shown it to me quickly, talked fast, avoided eye contact. I assumed he was just awkward. People often were around me, especially when they were trying not to say the wrong thing. I went back to unpacking. Clothes first. Folding them into the small wardrobe, I felt that familiar mix of relief and vulnerability that always came with settling somewhere new. Each item felt like a small declaration of who I was, who I had fought to be. I told myself this place would be temporary, just long enough to get my feet under me again. It was when I reached for my toiletries bag that I noticed the smell. Not gas, not exactly. More like dust and old paper. Something stale that didn't belong to a boiler room. It was faint, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. I followed it instinctively toward the plywood wall. The boiler enclosure had a narrow door, barely wide enough to squeeze through. I hadn't gone in there yet. I hesitated. Hand on the handle, feeling that irrational prickle along my spine that always came when I was about to discover something unpleasant. I told myself it was just nerves left over from moving, from years of being on guard. Inside, the boiler dominated the space, a hulking metal thing with pipes running into the ceiling. The smell was stronger here. I leaned closer, sniffed, felt foolish. Then I noticed something odd. The plywood behind the boiler looked newer than the rest, the screws cleaner, the wood a different shade. I crouched down, peered behind the pipes. There was a seam. I straightened up slowly, my pulse thudding in my ears. I pressed my fingers along the plywood, found where it flexed slightly under pressure. This wasn't just a wall. It was covering something. My first thought was insulation. My second was mold. My third was that I should probably stop poking around in someone else's property. But curiosity has always been my weakness, especially when mixed with the need to feel in control of my space. I fetched a screwdriver from my toolbox, the one thing I always kept accessible. I told myself I would just loosen one screw, take a look, and then forget about it. The screw came out too easily. I eased the plywood panel aside, just enough to peer into the gap. My breath caught. There was another room back there. Small, narrow, but unmistakably a room. I could see a concrete floor, bare walls, and something dark piled in the corner. I remember whispering, "What the hell?" to no one. I pulled the panel wider. The smell intensified, not rotten, just old. The room had no light, but the spill from the boiler area was enough to show shapes, boxes, a chair, and on that chair, folded neatly, a cardigan that looked exactly like mine. I stepped back so fast I hit the boiler again, the clang even louder this time. My chest tightened, that familiar squeeze of panic. I stared at the cardigan, my brain scrambling for explanations. Lots of people owned grey cardigans. This meant nothing. Except I owned that exact one. The loose thread on the sleeve, the faded spot near the hem. I walked closer despite myself, reached out, touched the fabric. It was soft, worn in the same places. I pulled it up, hands shaking. Underneath it was a stack of clothes. Jeans in my size. A blouse I had donated months earlier, or thought I had. My throat went dry. I dropped the cardigan like it burned. I backed out of the boiler room and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to breathe. This was impossible. Someone must have gone through my things before, copied my style, something. I was reaching, I knew that. The alternative was too unsettling. After a few minutes, I stood up again. I told myself I needed to see everything. Pretending it wasn't there wouldn't make it go away. The hidden room was colder than the rest of the apartment. The boxes were stacked neatly, labeled in careful handwriting. My name was on them. My full name, the one on my old documents, not the one I had started using more recently. I felt like the floor tilted under me. How could anyone here know that name? I hadn't given it to the landlord. I barely used it anymore. I opened one box. Inside were copies of my identification papers, old photos, medical forms, letters I had written but never sent. I recognized my own handwriting on envelopes I had torn up years ago. I sat down hard on the concrete floor. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had been watching me, collecting pieces of my life, storing them like artifacts. My first instinct was to call the police. My second was the cold realization of how that might go. Explaining who I was, why my documents looked the way they did, why someone might target me. I'd had enough dismissive looks to know how fragile that option felt. Instead, I called the landlord. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding annoyed. I asked him, as calmly as I could, about the room behind the boiler. There was a long pause. Then he said he didn't know what I was talking about. I told him I had found personal belongings back there. My belongings. Another pause, longer this time. He sighed heavily. He said the previous tenant had issues. He said they left things behind. He said I should not have gone back there. I asked him how the previous tenant had my things. He said he didn't know. He said, maybe we had similar tastes. His tone shifted, hardening. He told me to leave it alone. That was when I realized he was scared. I hung up without saying goodbye and went back into the hidden room. There was more than just boxes. In the corner, partially covered by a blanket, was a mattress. Indented, like someone had slept there recently. On the wall above it were photos of me, getting groceries, sitting at a cafe, entering my old building. Some were taken from angles that made my skin crawl, close, intimate. Others were clearly from a distance, grainy but unmistakable. I felt violated in a way I had no words for. My body reacted before my mind caught up, hands trembling, stomach churning. This wasn't about identity theft or obsession. This was about control. Someone had been mapping me, owning me, long before I ever stepped into this apartment. At the bottom of the wall was a notebook. I flipped it open. Dates filled the pages, spanning years. Observations. Notes about my routines, my moods, my transition, my setbacks. The handwriting matched the box labels. The last entry was dated 2 days before I moved in. It read, "She's back where I can keep her safe." I don't remember leaving the room. I remember being on the floor of my apartment, door locked, lights on, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the door, listening to every sound from the pipes, every creak above. In the morning, I packed. I didn't care about rent, about explanations. I called a friend and asked if I could stay with her. I didn't tell her everything, just that I wasn't safe. Before I left, I took photos of the room, all of it. I emailed them to myself, to her, to an online storage account. Evidence, in case someone tried to tell me I imagined it. I went back one last time to the boiler room. The panel was still open. The room was unchanged, except the notebook. It was gone. I left then, didn't look back. The police took my report more seriously than I expected once they saw the photos. An investigation followed. They traced the handwriting to the previous tenant, a person who had lived in several basement apartments across the city, always near people like me, always disappearing before things escalated further. They never found them. The landlord was fined, cited for illegal construction, for hiding the room. He claimed ignorance, but the court didn't believe him. I don't live in basement apartments anymore. I don't live alone if I can help it. I still think about that room, about the careful way my life was catalogued without my consent. But I also think about the fact that I found it, that I trusted my instincts, even when fear told me to stay quiet, that I left before becoming another entry in someone else's notebook. I'm telling you this because it happened, because it was real, and because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the dark itself, but realizing someone has been standing in it, watching you long before you ever noticed. I was standing on a chair, arms burning, trying to shove a loose bat of insulation back into place, when something solid stopped my hand cold. I froze there, fingertips pressed against something flat and wooden that absolutely should not have been there. I remember saying out loud, to no one, "That's not right," because I needed to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. I eased the insulation aside and uncovered the square outline of a hatch set into the ceiling. It was flush, painted the same dull off-white as everything else, with no handle, no visible hinges. Just a seam. My stomach dropped in a way I still can't fully explain. I had been living in that basement apartment for nearly 6 months, and I can swear to you I had never seen it before. I climbed down and stood there, staring up at it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Old house, converted spaces, hidden access points, all perfectly normal things. But my pulse wouldn't slow, and my skin had gone tight, like my body knew something my brain was still arguing with. I dragged the chair back under it and climbed up again. This time I ran my fingers along the seam. There was dust packed into it, except in 2 spots where it was clean, as if it had been opened recently. That's when the smell hit me. Not rot, not mold. Something more specific. Cold dirt and old concrete, like the inside of a foundation trench. I didn't open it right away. I climbed down again and paced the length of the apartment, barefoot on the thin carpet, trying to talk myself out of panic. I told myself the landlord should know. I told myself I'd call him in the morning. I told myself I was overreacting. Then I heard something shift above me. It wasn't loud, just a muted scrape, like wood against wood, followed by a soft thud that vibrated through the ceiling. I stood perfectly still, listening, my breath shallow and loud in my ears. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence that felt heavier than before. I went back to the chair. My hands were shaking as I pushed up on the hatch. It didn't budge at first. Then I felt it give, just slightly, enough to send a trickle of dust down into my hair and eyes. I swore and wiped my face, heart hammering, then pushed harder. The hatch swung down on hidden hinges, slow and controlled, like it had been oiled. Above it was a narrow cavity. Not an attic, not really. Just space between the ceiling and something solid beyond. I lifted my phone and turned on the light, angling it upward. Concrete filled the beam. Rough, poured concrete inches above the ceiling. Except it wasn't solid all the way across. There was a rectangular opening cut into it, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The edges were chipped and worn smooth in places. And there were footprints. They were pressed into the dust on the concrete surface, leading away from the opening and back toward it again. Fresh ones. I knew they were fresh because I could still see the sharp lines of tread, the tiny pebbles displaced around them. Someone had been up there recently. Someone had been moving around inside the foundation of the building. I backed off the chair so fast I nearly tipped it over. My first instinct was to grab my keys and leave, to get out of that apartment and never come back. But then the practical part of my brain kicked in. Someone living in the foundation didn't make sense. There had to be an explanation. Repairs, old access roads, anything. I called my landlord. It rang until it went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't trust my voice to sound calm. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the open hatch. Every creak of the building made me flinch. Every distant sound felt amplified, like it was happening right above my head. Eventually, against my better judgment, I climbed back up. I pushed my shoulders through the opening and wriggled forward until my chest was on the concrete. The space beyond was lower than I expected. I had to keep my head turned to the side to fit. My phone light swept across rough walls, moisture stains, and wooden supports that looked older than the rest of the building. The footprints continued along a narrow path, hugging the edge where the concrete met soil. I followed them, moving slowly, my breath echoing in the confined space. The air was stale, and every inhale tasted faintly metallic. The path led to another opening, this one vertical, dropping down into darkness. I leaned over the edge and shined my light down. The beam caught the top of a ladder bolted into the wall, descending into what looked like a deeper crawl space beneath the building. That's when I heard breathing. It wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale coming from below. I pulled back so hard I banged my head on the concrete above me, stars exploding behind my eyes. The breathing stopped instantly. I lay there, frozen, listening. Nothing. No movement, no sound. I told myself it could have been air moving through the space. I told myself I was imagining it. Then a voice came up from the darkness. "Don't," it said, calm, almost polite. I scrambled backward, scraping my elbows, barely aware of the pain. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, slamming the hatch closed and dragging the chair away, like that could somehow seal it. I called the police. I told them exactly what I'd found. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but said someone would come by. While I waited, I noticed things I hadn't before. the faint line of dirt along my bathroom baseboard, the way one of the vents had been slightly bent inward. The missing food I'd blamed on myself for getting. The officers arrived and listened. They climbed up, looked into the hatch, and came back down shaking their heads. One of them told me it was probably an old access route from before the basement was converted. He said there was no sign anyone was living there now. I showed them the footprints. They crouched, looked closer, exchanged a glance. One of them climbed up again, this time with a flashlight. He was gone longer than before. When he came back down, his face had changed. They asked me to step outside. More officers arrived. Then the landlord. Then someone from the council. They went in and out of the building while I stood on the sidewalk in a borrowed jacket, watching my windows. Eventually, a man with a clipboard came over and explained it to me. Decades ago, parts of the foundation had been hollowed out during a renovation that was never properly recorded. A transient man had been living down there for months, using the old access points to move between buildings in the block. They found him hiding in a section that connected to the neighboring property. He had been using my apartment's hatch because it was the easiest to reach. I moved out that week. I still think about how close he was, how many nights he was up there while I slept below, unaware. The hatch is sealed now, they told me, filled with concrete. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in my new place, I swear I can hear slow breathing above me, steady and patient, waiting for me to forget again. I was standing barefoot in the hallway, holding my toothbrush, staring down at the wet footprints before my brain had fully caught up with what my eyes were telling me. They started at the shared bathroom door, dark and clear on the linoleum, and they led straight to my apartment door, stopping exactly where my feet were planted. I remember whispering no without meaning to, like the word might push them away. I bent down and touched one with my finger. Cold, fresh. My door was locked. I knew it was locked because I locked it every time. The way you do when you live alone in a basement and share a bathroom with strangers upstairs. I pressed my palm flat against the door as if I could feel something breathing on the other side. Nothing. Just the familiar hum of the pipes. I went back into my unit and shut the door, sliding the bolt with more force than necessary. I leaned against it and tried to laugh, but the sound came out wrong. I told myself someone must have walked past barefoot, and the prints just lined up that way. Coincidence. The word felt thin. The apartment was small enough that I could see almost all of it without moving. Bed, table, sink, the narrow wardrobe. Everything looked exactly how I had left it. I checked the floor anyway, every inch. No footprints inside. No damp marks. The bathroom footprints ended at my door, like they had reached a wall. That morning I skipped brushing my teeth and went straight to work with a tight jaw and a buzzing head. All day I replayed the image of those footprints. Not shoes, not socks, bare feet, toes and arches pressed into the floor. Whoever it was had stood there long enough for the water to pool. That night I told the woman upstairs about it. She was older, kind, with careful eyes. She frowned and said the other tenant worked nights and probably forgot his towel. She smiled in a way that suggested I was being silly. I smiled back because it was easier. The next morning the footprints were there again. This time they were clearer. The bathroom door stood open, the light off. The prince crossed the hallway, paused at my door, then turned back toward the bathroom, overlapping themselves like someone had shifted their weight. I checked my lock before I even looked at the floor. Still locked. Solid. I knelt and followed them with my eyes, my stomach tightening with each step. They were my size. That realization landed slowly, like a bruise. I compared them to my own feet, pressing my toes next to a print. Too close. I scrubbed the hallway myself before leaving, using paper towels and the harsh cleaner from under my sink. The smell burned my nose. I didn't want anyone else seeing them. I didn't know why, but it felt personal, like an accusation. I started paying attention to sounds. The building had always been noisy in a normal way. Pipes knocking, floorboards creaking. Now every sound felt intentional, directed. When I showered, I listened for movement outside the curtain. When I slept, I kept one hand on my phone. On the third night, I woke to the sound of water running. I lay still, counting my breaths, listening. The sound came from above, the shared bathroom. Someone was using the sink or the shower. I checked the time without turning on the screen fully, afraid of the light. It was late. The other tenant was supposed to be working. The woman upstairs had said she slept early. I waited until the water stopped, then waited longer. My heart beat so hard it felt like it might knock on the door for me. Eventually, I stood up and opened my door a crack. The hallway was empty. The bathroom door was closed. I didn't open it. I couldn't make myself. I shut my door and locked it again, sliding down to sit on the floor. The footprints were there in the morning. Again. I stopped telling myself stories then. I stopped trying to explain it away. Something was happening that didn't fit into the shape of my life, and pretending otherwise was making me feel like I was splitting in half. I bought a small camera and pointed it at my door from inside my apartment. It wasn't fancy, just enough to record movement. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want their reactions. I wanted proof. That night I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I jerked awake, convinced I had heard the lock move. When I finally got up in the morning, my hands were shaking as I checked the camera. At first, nothing happened. Hours passed in fast forward. Me leaving, me coming back. Darkness falling. Then, deep into the night, the screen flickered. The door didn't open. The handle didn't move. But the sound came through, faint but unmistakable, breathing. Slow, close. The camera caught a shadow at the bottom of the frame, something blocking the light under the door. It stayed there for a long time. Too long. I turned off the video and sat on my bed, staring at the wall. I felt stupid for expecting something clearer, something that would make sense. Instead, I felt watched in a way that made my skin crawl. The next day I confronted the other tenant. He looked confused, then offended. He showed me his shoes, his socks. He laughed in a brittle way and said he never walked barefoot anywhere. He worked nights. He was barely home. I believed him. Or maybe I just didn't want him to be the answer. That evening I noticed something new. My towel, which I always hung inside my unit, was damp. Not wet, but used. I held it to my face and smelled the soap. It was mine. Exactly the same. I checked the camera footage again. The breathing returned every night. Always after the water sounds. Always stopping before morning. I stopped using the shared bathroom. I washed at my sink, brushed my teeth over a bowl. My body felt constantly tense. like I was bracing for a blow that never landed. The woman upstairs knocked on my door one afternoon. She asked if everything was all right. I almost told her everything. Instead, I asked about the apartment before mine. Her face changed in a way that told me I had finally asked the right question. She said the previous tenant had been a woman. She hesitated before saying anything else. I waited. She said the woman had complained about the bathroom too, about someone using it when no one else was awake, about wet floors. I asked where she went. The woman upstairs looked down at her hands and said she had been found in the shared bathroom one morning. Slipped, they said. Hit her head. An accident. I felt cold spread through me, starting at my feet. I stayed another night after speaking with her because part of me needed to understand the pattern, not just escape it. Fear without explanation had started to feel worse than fear with a shape. I called in sick to work and spent the day testing things. I measured nothing, wrote nothing down, just paid attention. I noted how long the bathroom light stayed warm after being turned off. I listened to how sound traveled through the vents when I spoke softly, then louder. I pressed my ear to the shared wall and tapped. The echo came back wrong, like there was space where there shouldn't be any. I unscrewed the vent cover inside my unit and shined my phone light into the darkness. The metal duct curved down instead of up. That made no sense. I followed it as far as I could see, my arm trembling, until the beam caught on something pale. I told myself it was insulation. I told myself that several times before putting the cover back on. That afternoon, I knocked on the landlord's door. He lived on the top floor and smelled like dust and old paper. I asked about renovations. He shrugged and said the building had been altered over the years. I asked about the bathroom. He said it had always been shared. When I mentioned the woman who died, his mouth tightened. He said accidents happened. He said people liked stories. I went back downstairs feeling smaller than before. When night came, I left my door unlocked on purpose. My hands shook as I did it. I set the camera lower, angled toward the floor. The water started. I stood in the middle of my room, heart racing, every muscle screaming at me to stop this. Wet footsteps approached. They didn't rush. They didn't hesitate. They stopped at my threshold. The door opened. I didn't see a face. I saw legs first, pale and slick, toes curling against the floor, like they were learning how to stand again. The smell of soap filled the room. She stepped inside slowly, like she was afraid of falling. Her eyes never met mine. They were fixed on the towel hanging behind me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. She reached out and touched the fabric, squeezing water from it onto the floor. Then she turned toward the vent, toward the wall, and for the first time, she looked at me. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something she had been practicing for a long time. No sound came out. Instead, water spilled down her chin. She took a step back, then another, retreating the way she had come, leaving the door open behind her. The camera caught everything. I took the footage to the police. I expected disbelief. I expected questions I couldn't answer. Instead, they went quiet. They asked for the landlord. They asked about the building plans. They found the crawl space behind the wall. They found what was left of her, sealed off during a renovation, hidden to avoid responsibility. The bathroom had never been the place she died. It had been the place she waited. When it was over, When the walls were opened and the space was cleared, the water stopped running at night. The hallway stayed dry. I moved out anyway, because knowing doesn't undo feeling. Because some things stay with you. But now, when I think back, I understand the footprints weren't following me. They were leading me to the truth. The landlord was fined and the building was closed for a time. People asked me how I felt about that, as if there was a correct answer. I felt tired. I felt hollowed out, and then slowly filled back in with ordinary things like sleep and food and the sound of traffic outside a different window. I went to therapy for a while. I learned how to talk about fear without apologizing for it. I learned how to trust my senses again. For months I carried my keys clenched in my fist, even inside my own home. Over time, my grip loosened. Sometimes I dream of water and wake up expecting to hear it running. Most nights I don't. When I do, it's just a memory replaying itself, harmless in the light. I still avoid shared bathrooms. I don't explain why. I don't need to. What happened to me was specific and contained, tied to a place and a person, and a series of choices that finally ended. I tell you this because you asked why I left that apartment so suddenly, and because saying it out loud makes it feel finished. It is finished. The hallway is dry, the door stays closed, and the footprints, wherever they belong now, no longer lead to me. I know how this sounds. I know how easy it is to decide I was stressed or imagining patterns where none existed. I thought that too, at first. But I also know what I saw, what I recorded, and what was uncovered because I refused to ignore it. Living alone teaches you to be your own witness. No one else hears the quiet details. No one else notices when something small repeats itself until it becomes impossible to dismiss. If there is anything I learned, it is that fear often arrives politely. It leaves signs instead of breaking in, wet footprints instead of forced locks, familiar soap instead of strange smells. It asks to be noticed. When we don't look, when we smooth it away and tell ourselves comforting stories, it lingers. What finally ended it wasn't courage or anger. It was attention. I paid attention long enough for the truth to surface, and when it did, it was heavy and human and sad. That made it something I could live with. I don't feel watched anymore. I don't feel followed. I feel like someone who finished a sentence that had been hanging in the air for too long. That is all it ever wanted, and now it has it. And when I lock my door now, it is just a habit, not a prayer. And that difference matters more than anything else to me. I was standing in the hallway with my tablet still in my hand when I realized the report had changed, and the first thing I felt was irritation, not fear, because irritation made sense. I had just finished inspecting the building less than 12 hours earlier, had uploaded the report myself, had watched the progress bar complete, and now the file on my screen was missing an entire section. I scrolled back up, thumb stiff, eyes burning from lack of sleep, and read the header again to make sure I had not opened the wrong document. Same address. Same inspection date. My name still there, typed cleanly at the bottom like a signature I didn't remember signing. But the basement level was gone. I leaned back against the concrete wall, outside the apartment door I was temporarily living in, feeling the cold through my jacket, and told myself there was a simple explanation. Sync error. Software glitch. Someone at the office editing formatting. I had been a housing inspector for over a decade. I trusted systems, procedures, paper trails. They were supposed to be boring, predictable. I opened my own saved copy, the one stored locally on the tablet. That one still showed everything: the basement unit, the storage rooms behind it, the narrow service corridor that did not appear on the building's official plans, the notes I had written about locked doors with no identifiers. I remembered standing right here the night before, measuring tape stretched, flashlight in my mouth, documenting each space carefully, because something about the layout felt off. Too much square footage for what the plans claimed. Rooms stacked like boxes inside boxes. I pushed off the wall and unlocked my apartment, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. The lock clicked louder than usual. The sound echoed, or maybe I was listening harder now. I set the tablet on the small table by the sink and opened my laptop, telling myself I would confirm the server version and then forget about it. The server version matched the altered one. No basement, no notes, no mention of additional rooms. Just a clean inspection of a small residential structure with no irregularities. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes when you realize you are about to waste time arguing with a problem no one else believes exists. I called the office. My supervisor answered with her usual clipped tone, already halfway through another task. I asked her if anyone had edited my report overnight. She paused, keyboard sounds stopping. Then she said no, not unless it flagged something automatically. I asked what it could have flagged. She said there was no record of a basement unit at that address. Never had been. According to municipal records, the lowest level was a shared utility floor, non-residential, and therefore outside my inspection scope. I told her I was living in the basement. She laughed, just a short exhale, and said I meant ground level. I told her no. I told her I had walked down a concrete stairwell, unlocked a door marked with a hand-painted letter, and moved into a space below street level with pipes overhead and a single narrow window near the ceiling. She didn't laugh that time. She said we would talk later and hung up. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the building, the low mechanical sounds I had tuned out the first few nights. I looked around the apartment, really looked, noticing how the walls seemed thicker than necessary, how the corners were not quite square. I opened the door again and stepped back into the hallway. The stairwell leading up was where it should be. The corridor behind my unit was still there, long and dim, ending in a locked metal door I had not been able to open. I walked it again, counting my steps, hand brushing the wall. 7 doors, 3 unmarked, 4 locked. I reached the end and pressed my ear to the metal. I heard movement. Not voices, not machinery. Something shifting, deliberate, like furniture being dragged slowly across concrete. I knocked. The sound rang out sharply. The movement stopped. I knocked again, harder, and called out that this was a city inspection. Nothing answered. I went back inside my unit and wrote a new report from scratch, documenting everything again, attaching photographs, saving copies everywhere I could think of. I emailed it directly to my supervisor and flagged it as urgent. When I woke the next morning, my inbox was empty of replies. The report was gone again. This time, my local copy was altered too. The photos still existed, but the file names had changed, dates wrong, metadata wiped, in one image. The corridor wall appeared smooth and uninterrupted, the door at the end erased, as if it had never been there. My hands shook as I held the tablet up and compared it to the wall in front of me. The door was still there, cold, solid. Real? I went upstairs and knocked on the landlord's door. He opened it just wide enough to see me, eyes cautious. I asked him about the basement. He frowned and said there was no basement apartment. I told him I was renting it from him. He said I was mistaken. I told him my name. He said he didn't recognize it. I asked who lived downstairs. He said no one. I asked who had lived there before me. He stared at me for a long time and then said he didn't like jokes and closed the door. That afternoon, I went to City Archives. I pulled permits, old plans, renovation records. The building existed. The upper floors existed. The basement did not. But I found something else. Older documents. Handwritten notes from inspections decades earlier. Mentions of sublevels sealed for safety. Temporary housing during post-war shortages. Units never formally decommissioned. Rooms that were supposed to be emptied and closed. Rooms that required occupants to be removed first. I returned to the building after dark, heart pounding, carrying a crowbar from my car. I told myself I was overreacting, but my body did not believe me. At the end of the corridor, I wedged the bar into the seam of the metal door and pried. The lock gave way with a scream of metal. The door opened onto another stairwell going down. The air smelled stale, like paper and damp stone. I descended slowly, light shaking in my hand. Below, there were more doors, some open, some closed. Inside the open ones were rooms like mine. Furnished, lived in, abandoned in a hurry. On a table in one room, I found inspection reports. My reports. Printed. Marked up with red ink. I saw my name crossed out. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a final room. Inside were filing cabinets stacked to the ceiling. Each drawer labeled with addresses. Each containing records of spaces that no longer officially existed. I understood then. The inspections were never meant to fix these places. They were meant to confirm containment. I backed out slowly, heart racing, and locked the door behind me as best I could. The next morning, my phone rang. My supervisor told me my assignment was complete. The building was cleared. No further action required. I moved out that day. I resigned a week later. The building is still there. I pass it sometimes. The basement window is gone now, sealed with brick. And when I check the records, the inspection is listed as closed, approved, finalized, as if it never happened.